All right, students, we are about to begin chapter 7. If you guys remember anything about a plot diagram, that kind of diagram that outlines everything that happens in a book, where it has that line and that triangle in the middle, and then another line, you've got exposition, rising action, climax, and then falling action and resolution. Chapter 7 would be our climax. Everything, the tension between potentially Daisy and Tom and Gatsby and Daisy and Tom and Jordan and Nick. All of this kind of comes to a head in this chapter. So my book starts on page 113 for chapter 7. And I think if you have the school-owned book, it's about 2 pages before that, so maybe 115. So go ahead and open up your books and we will get started. There are a couple of questions that I want you to consider as we're reading. One is, what happens when you've accomplished your dream? As we know, Gatsby's dream was Daisy, getting the girl, doing everything that he can to get the girl, and he finally has accomplished that. We saw that in the end of chapter 5 and all throughout chapter 6, where they've started their affair. But now the question is, what do you have to live for, right? And again, if you can't necessarily compare this to a fictional scenario, then think about real life scenarios, right? Olympic athletes who spend their entire childhood and young adult life and early 20s training and eating and cutting out social life in order to accomplish one of the highest goals in athletics, right? What do they do once that's done? Everything up to that point has led them to that. How do they feel when they've accomplished it? And what do they do with the rest of their life afterwards? Because hopefully they still have many, many more decades to live, right? Same thing with like actors who have won multiple Academy Awards. So if you can't compare it to a fictional situation, think about a real life situation. The second theme and just idea that really comes up within this chapter is also, what is true love? How is love described in the book? Do Daisy and Tom really love each other? Do Gatsby and Daisy really love each other? What does that look like? What is true love? According to the book, as well as based off of your own definition of it. So those are just ideas that I want you guys to kind of be thinking about as we go and read. So go ahead and turn to page 113, and we are going to get started. It was when curiosity about Gatsby was at its highest that the lights in his house failed to go on one Saturday night. And as obscurely as it had begun, his career as Trimalchio was over. Only gradually did I become aware that the automobiles which turned expectantly into his drive stayed for just a minute and then drove sulkily away. Wondering if he were sick, I went over to find out. An unfamiliar butler with a villainous face squinted at me suspiciously from the door. So before I go on, let's just explain Trimalchio. So Gatsby, everything that he did, all these parties, all of these extravagant purchases were all to get Daisy's attention. And we know that after that was revealed to us in, I believe, chapter 4. But now he has Daisy. They are sleeping together. They're having their affair. And he also realized in chapter 6 that she wasn't really into the parties, and that wasn't something that necessarily made her happy. And so now there is no more point to open his house to all of New York or have all of these people over, because the goal has been accomplished, right? So he has shut down his house, and Nick compares him to a character from Greek myth called Trimalchio. And there are a couple pictures on the screen, but Trimalchio was an arrogant former slave who had become wealthy by tactics that most would find distasteful. And so Nick draws a really apt comparison between Gatsby, who used to not be wealthy, which is why Daisy rejected him in the first place, and, compared to this arrogant former slave, and has gone into some sort of business with Meyer Wolfsheim and has become wealthy by, again, tactics that maybe a lot of people wouldn't necessarily find glamorous or good. And so it's an apt comparison. But we are continuing. Is Mr. Gatsby sick? Nope. After a pause, he added, sir, in a dilatory, grudging way. I hadn't seen him around, and I was rather worried. Tell him Mr. Carroway came over. Who? He demanded rudely. Carroway. Carroway. All right, I'll tell him. Abruptly, he slammed the door. My Finn informed me that Gatsby had dismissed every servant in his house a week ago and replaced them with half a dozen others who went into West Egg Village to be bribed by the tradesmen but ordered moderate supplies over the telephone. The grocery boy reported that the kitchen looked like a pigsty, and the general opinion in the village was that the new people weren't servants at all. Next day, Gatsby called me on the phone. Going away? I inquired. No, old sport. I hear you fired all your servants. I wanted somebody who wouldn't gossip. Daisy comes over quite often in the afternoons. So the whole caravansary had fallen in it like a card house at the disapproval in her eyes. There's some people Wolfsheim wanted to do something for. They're all brothers and sisters. They used to run a small hotel. I see. He was calling up at Daisy's request. Would I come to lunch at her house tomorrow? Miss Baker would be there. Half an hour later, Daisy herself telephoned and seemed relieved to find that I was coming. Something was up. And yet, I couldn't believe that they would choose this occasion for a scene, especially for the rather harrowing scene that Gatsby had outlined in the garden. The next day was broiling, almost the last, certainly the warmest of the summer. So we'll pause here. Remember, in chapter 5, when Gatsby and Daisy reconnect, I talked about this motif of weather, this reoccurring idea or image that helps underline a theme. And so this motif of weather comes up again, but rather than rain, it is broiling. It is really, really hot. And Nick describes it as the hottest day of summer. So think about all of those things, like how you feel when it's humid and sticky outside, when California is 109 degrees. Are you necessarily in your best mood? What do you want to do? How do you respond to other people? And just think of passions are raised. They're probably going to be a little bit sharper with people and angry. And also think about what has just been said over the telephone between Nick and Gatsby and Nick and Daisy. Daisy wants Gatsby and Nick to come over to her house to have lunch with Tom and Jordan. And so you're going to have Daisy, Tom, Jordan, Nick, and Gatsby all sitting together for a lunch dinner situation. And until this point, none of them have really ever been alone altogether. And Tom doesn't know about the affair. And, Gatsby obviously really, really wants to make this public because it's more of an announcement and a visual sign that he has gotten the girl. And so you can imagine that this day, when it's hot outside and everyone's coming together for the first time privately, is going to be interesting. As my train emerged from the tunnel into the sunlight, only the hot whistles of the National Biscuit Company broke the simmering hush at noon. The straw seats of the car hovered on the edge of combustion. The woman next to me perspired delicately for a while into her white shirtwaist, and then, as her newspaper dampened under her fingers, lapsed despairingly into a deep heat with a desolate cry. Her pocketbook slapped the floor. "Oh my," she gasped. I picked it up with a weary bend and handed it back to her, holding it at arm's length and by the extreme tip of the corners to indicate that I had no designs upon it, that he wasn't going to steal it. But everyone nearby, including the woman, suspected me just the same. "Hot," said the conductor to familiar faces. "Some weather. Hot, hot, hot. Is it hot enough for you? Is it hot? Is it?" My commutation ticket came back to me with a dark stain from his hand. That anyone should care in this heat whose flushed lips he kissed, whose head made damp the pajama pocket over his heart. Through the hall of the Buchanan's house blew a faint wind, carrying the sound of the telephone bell out to Gatsby and me as we waited by the door. "The master's body," roared the butler into the mouthpiece. "I'm sorry, madame, but we can't furnish it. It's far too hot to touch this noon." What he really said was, "Yes, yes, I'll see." So the butler is on the phone with Myrtle Wilson over in the garage. He set down the receiver and came toward us, glistening slightly, to take our stiff straw hats. "Madame expects you in the salon," he cried, needlessly indicating the direction. In this heat, every extra gesture was an affront to the common store of life. The room, shadowed well with its awnings, was dark and cool. Daisy and Jordan lay upon an enormous couch like silver idols, weighing down their own white dresses against the singing breeze of the fans. Now, again, this is a stark contrast. The last time that we saw this living room was in chapter 1. And if you guys remember, we spent a lot of time talking about this room, right? In chapter 1, it's cool, it's breezy. The white curtains are flowing in and fluttering, and Jordan and Daisy are giggling and laughing, and it's kind of the scene of paradise. And now there is a very stark contrast between what this room looks like. Everything is weighed down and it's dark, and people are sweating, and the girls are compared to, like, and using a simile, are compared to silver idols, so heavy statues that weigh down their own white dresses against the singing breeze of the fan. So even the air in the room is artificial. And again, this underscores a potentially deeper idea about what this day and what this upcoming scene is going to entail. We can't move, they said together. Jordan's fingers, powdered white over their tan, rested for a moment in mine. And Mr. Thomas Buchanan, the athlete, I inquired. Simultaneously, I heard his voice, gruff, muffled, husky, at the hall telephone. Gatsby stood in the center of the crimson carpet, noticed the color, and gazed around with fascinated eyes. Daisy watched him and laughed. Her sweet, exciting laugh. A tiny gust of powder rose from her bosom into the air. The rumor is, whispered Jordan, that that's Tom's girl on the telephone. We were silent. The voice in the hall rose high with annoyance. Very well, then. I won't sell you that car at all. I'm under no obligations to you at all. And as for your bothering me about it at lunchtime, I won't stand that at all. So Tom is getting annoyed that George Wilson keeps calling him to ask about that car that Tom has continuously promised to sell him. And again, Tom never intended to sell him the car, but we know that it was an excuse for him to go to the garage and be in cahoots sexually with Myrtle, right? That's the whole reason. And now George is getting pissed because it's been months and he still has no car to buy. Holding down the receiver, said Daisy cynically. No, he's not, I assured her. It's a bona fide deal. I happen to know all about it. Tom flung open the door, blocked out its space for a moment with his thick body, and hurried into the room. Mr. Gatsby, he put out his broad, flat hand with well-concealed dislike. I'm glad to see you, sir. Nick. Make us a cold drink, cried Daisy. As he left the room again, she got up and went over to Gatsby and pulled his face down, kissing him on the mouth. You know I love you, she murmured. You forget there's a lady present, said Jordan. Daisy looked around doubtfully. You kiss Nick, too. What a low, vulgar girl. I don't care, cried Daisy, and began to clog on the brick fireplace. So Daisy's dancing. She's like, I'm in love. I just kissed Gatsby. Why don't you, Jordan, kiss Nick? You know, she's happy. She's dancing. Then she remembered the heat and sat down guiltily on the couch, just as a freshly laundered nurse, leading in a little girl, came into the room. Blessed precious, she crooned, holding out her arms. Come to your own mother that loves you. The child, relinquished by the nurse, rushed across the room and rooted shyly into her mother's dress. The blessed precious, did mother get powder on your old yellowy hair? Stand up now and say howdy do. Gatsby and I, in turn, leaned down and took the small, reluctant hand. Afterward, he kept looking at the child with surprise. I don't think he had ever really believed in its existence before. So remember, Gatsby has this idea of who Daisy is and what she represents, money and status and love. And for 5 years, he has been envisioning her just as he met her 5 years before he went to war, before she married Tom, before she even had a kid. And so the idea that she actually has a child, and that child is not his child, but a child that she had with a man that she got married with, who wasn't Gatsby, is almost kind of shocking to him, right? He's waking up from this dream that everything was just as it was 5 years ago. And it's that repetition of that idea that he believes he can repeat the past. He believes that he can just pick off right where they left off, when really 5 years of time, 5 years of maturity, 5 years of relationship, and oh, by the way, a physical representation of that through a child has happened. And so that's why he's shocked. I got dressed before luncheon, said the child, turning eagerly to Daisy. That's because your mother wanted to show you off. Her face bent into the single wrinkle of a small white neck. You dream, you absolute little dream. Yes, admitted the child calmly. Aunt Jordan's got a white dress, too. How do you like your mother's friends? Daisy turned her around so that she faced Gatsby. Do you think they're pretty? Where's Daddy? She doesn't look like her father, explained Daisy. She looks like me. She's got my hair and shape of my face. And who knows if Daisy's actually saying that just to say that, or if she's trying to appease potentially what she sees going on Gatsby's face. That really, she looks more like me than Tom. Don't worry, she looks like me, not Tom, right? Just to help him feel more comfortable with the fact that she has a child. Daisy sat back upon the couch. The nurse took a step forward and held out her hand. Come, Pammy. Goodbye, sweetheart. With a reluctant backward glance, the well-disciplined child held to her nurse's hand and was pulled out the door, just as Tom came back, preceding 4 gin rickeys that had clicked full of ice. Gatsby took up his drink. They certainly look cool, he said, with visible tension. So again, Gatsby's tense, right? He's seeing Tom, he's seeing Daisy in her natural environment with her child and with her husband. We drank in long, greedy swallows. I read somewhere that the sun's getting hotter every year, said Tom genially. It seems that pretty soon the Earth's going to fall into the sun. Or, wait a minute, it's just the opposite. The sun's getting colder every year. So again, reiterating that Tom just kind of talks and he doesn't necessarily know what he's talking about. Come outside, he suggested to Gatsby. I'd like you to have a look at this place. I went with them out onto the veranda. On the green sound, stagnant in the heat, one small sail crawled slowly toward the fresher sea. Gatsby's eyes followed it momentarily. He raised his hand and pointed across the bay. I'm right across from you. So you are. Our eyes lifted over the rose beds and the hot lawn and the weedy refuse of the dog days along shore. Slowly, the white wings of the boat moved against the blue, cool limit of the sky. Ahead lay the scalloped ocean and the abounding Blessed Isles. There's sport for you, said Tom, nodding. I'd like to be out there with them for about an hour. We had luncheon in the dining room, darkened too against the heat, and drank down nervous gaiety with the cold ale. What'll we do with ourselves this afternoon? Cried Daisy. And the day after that, and the next 30 years. Don't be morbid, Jordan said. Life starts all over again when it gets crisp in the fall. But it's so hot, insisted Daisy, on the verge of tears, and everything's so confused. Let's all go to town. So again, it's hot, it's uncomfortable. This is all very, very awkward, especially because Daisy and Gatsby are in the heat of their affair, and they're all trying to act like nothing's going on. Her voice struggled on through the heat, beating against it, molding it senseless into forms. I've heard of making a garage out of a stable, Tom was saying to Gatsby, but I'm the first man who ever made a stable out of a garage. Who wants to go to town? Demanded Daisy insistently. Gatsby's eyes floated toward her. Ah, she cried, you look so cool. Their eyes met, and they stared together at each other, alone in space. With an effort, she glanced down at the table. You always look so cool, she repeated. She had told him that she loved him, and Tom Buchanan saw. He was astounded. His mouth opened a little, and he looked at Gatsby and then back at Daisy as if he had just recognized her as someone he knew a long time ago. So, Daisy and Gatsby didn't actually say the words, I love you to each other, but it was one of those kind of silent communications, not only through their body language and their eyes, but also through the repetition of her saying, you always look so cool. The tone of voice and the way that she looked at him communicated very clearly, not only to Gatsby, but also to Tom, who happened to see that they are having an affair. And up to this point in time, Tom had no idea. You resemble the advertisement of the man, she went on innocently. You know, the advertisement of the man. All right, broke in Tom quickly. I'm perfectly willing to go to town. Come on, we're all going to town. He got up, his eyes still flashing between Gatsby and his wife. No one moved. Come on, his temper cracked a little. What's the matter anyhow? If we're going to town, let's start. His hand, trembling with his effort at self-control, bore to his lips that last of his glass of ale. Daisy's voice got us to our feet and out onto the blazing gravel drive. Are we just going to go, she objected, like this? Aren't we going to let anyone smoke a cigarette first? Everybody smoked all through lunch. Oh, let's have fun, she begged him. It's too hot to fuss. He didn't answer. Have it your own way, she said. Come on, Jordan. So now there's kind of this like subtle power struggle going on, right? Tom didn't want to go to town, but now that he's found this out, he's like angry and tense and he just wants to do something. And he's trying very, very hard to rein in this idea that he has lost control of his wife and his life, right? And now Daisy's saying, "Oh, well, now you want to go to town, but like you're not even letting us get ready. And why can't we smoke a cigarette?" So it's kind of this like power play between them. Um, and so they all decide to go to town now. So she and Jordan go upstairs to get dressed. They went upstairs to get ready while we three men stood there shuffling the hot pebbles with our feet. A silver curve of the moon hovered already in the western sky. Gatsby started to speak, changed his mind, but not before Tom wheeled and faced him expectantly. "Pardon me?" "Have you got your stables here?" asked Gatsby with an effort. "About a quarter of a mile down the road." "Oh." A pause. "I don't see the idea of going to town," broke out Tom savagely. "Women get these notions in their head." Again, all of that's undertext and implied that it's not just that women get ideas to go to town, it's that women get ideas that they can just have affairs. And again, notice the language broke out Tom savagely. So it's reiterating his aggressive nature. "Shall we take anything to drink?" called Daisy from the upper window. "I'll get some whiskey," answered Tom. He went inside. Gatsby turned to me rigidly. "I can't say anything in this house, old sport." "She's got an indiscreet voice," I remarked. "It's full of—" I hesitated. "Her voice is full of money," he said suddenly. That was it. I'd never understood it before. It was full of money. That was the inexhaustible charm that rose and fell in it, the jingle of it, the cymbal song of it. High in a white palace, the king's daughter, the golden girl. And so we all noticed the charm of Daisy's voice. When you guys wrote that paragraph, a lot of you guys said, yeah, Daisy's voice is her most defining character trait. And you guys are right. Her voice, she was born into old Southern gentility money. She was raised with old money. She rejected Gatsby because at the time he wanted to marry her. He didn't have any money. She married Tom with pomp and circumstance because he too was old money. Everything that she wears, everything that she does exudes and bleeds wealth. And so does her voice. And so if you go back and you notice all of the quotes that deal with her voice, those descriptions are also descriptions that you could put to and describe money with. And Gatsby recognizes it, right? Because Gatsby sees Daisy, loves Daisy, but also loves everything that she represents, which is wealth and money and something that he has been shooting for since he met her. Tom came out of the house, wrapping a quart bottle in a towel, followed by Daisy and Jordan, wearing small tight hats of metallic cloth and carrying light capes over his arms. "Shall we all go in my car?" suggested Gatsby. He felt the hot green leather of the seat. "I'd have left it in the shade." "Is it a standard shift?" demanded Tom. "Yes. Well, you take my coupe and let me drive your car to town." The suggestion was distasteful to Gatsby. "I don't think there's much gas," he objected. "Plenty of gas," said Tom boisterously. He looked at the gauge. "And if it runs out, I can stop at the drugstore. You can buy anything at a drugstore nowadays." A pause followed this apparently pointless remark. Daisy looked at Tom frowning, and an indefinable expression, at once definitely unfamiliar and vaguely recognizable, as if I had only heard it described in words, passed over Gatsby's face. "Come on, Daisy," said Tom, pressing her with his hand towards Gatsby's car. "I'll take you in this circus wagon." He opened the door, but she moved out from the circle of his arm. "You take Nick and Jordan. We'll follow you in the coupe." She walked close to Gatsby, touching his coat with her hand. Jordan and Tom and I got into the front seat of Gatsby's car. Tom pushed the unfamiliar gears tentatively, and we shot off into the oppressive heat, leaving them out of sight behind. "Did you see that?" demanded Tom. "See what?" He looked at me keenly, realizing that Jordan and I must have known all along. "You think I'm pretty dumb, don't you?" he suggested. "Perhaps I am, but I have almost a second sight sometimes that tells me what to do. Maybe you don't believe that, but science." He paused. So before I go on, let's just talk about this because it seems like it's not important, but it is. They all walk out of the house, and one car can't fit all of them. And so Gatsby not only drove his car to the Buchanan's house, and obviously Tom has his car parked at his house, right? Tom's car is blue. Gatsby's car, we know, is yellow. And Tom, maybe in a power move and trying to prove his masculinity, is like, well, we'll take your car, Gatsby. And he tries to get Daisy to get in the car, in Gatsby's car with him. But Daisy says, nope, I'm going to drive with Gatsby. And so they switch cars. So you've got Tom, Jordan, and Nick in Gatsby's yellow car. And you have Gatsby and Daisy in Tom's blue car. Just take a mental visual picture of that in your brain, because this is going to come into play a little bit later. And so Daisy and Gatsby race off in the car, and Tom then turns to Nick and Jordan and says, could you believe that look? And then he thinks that they didn't know, and then he realizes they knew about the affair all along. And the next couple lines really are just showing that Tom and Gatsby are essentially, again, not toxic masculinity, but trying to show who's more man by racing their cars to New York. So we'll pick back up again. So he paused. The immediate contingency overtook him, pulled him back from the edge of the theoretical abyss. I've made a small investigation of this fellow, he continued. I could have gone deeper if I'd known. Do you mean you've been to a medium? Inquired Jordan humorously. What? So that's a psychic. What? Confused, he stared at us as we laughed. A medium? About Gatsby. About Gatsby? No, I haven't. I said I'd been making a small investigation of his past. And you found he was an Oxford man, said Jordan helpfully. An Oxford man? He was incredulous. Like hell he is. He wears a pink suit. Nevertheless, he's an Oxford man. Oxford, New Mexico, snorted Tom contemptuously, or something like that. Listen, Tom, if you're such a snob, why did you invite him to lunch? Demanded Jordan crossly. Daisy invited him. She knew him before we were married, God knows where. We were all irritable now with the fading ale, and aware of it, we drove for a while in silence. Then, as Dr. T.J. Eckelberg's faded eyes came into sight down the road, I remembered Gatsby's caution about gasoline. We've got enough to get us to town, said Tom. But there's a garage right there, objected Jordan. I don't want to get stalled in this baking heat. Tom threw on the brakes impatiently, and we slid into the abrupt, dusty stop under Wilson's sign. After a moment, the proprietor emerged from the interior of his establishment and gazed, hollow-eyed, at the car. So remember, there's no gasoline. They're driving, and they decide, Tom, Jordan, and Nick, to stop at Wilson's garage and fill up Gatsby's yellow car with gasoline. So again, notice the description of George Wilson. He's always described as either gray or ashen-faced, and even here too, he's gazing hollow-eyed, so almost lifeless, at the car. So we're in the Valley of Ashes again. Let's have some gas, cried Tom roughly. What do you think we stopped for, to admire the view? I'm sick, said Wilson without moving. Been sick all day. What's the matter? I'm all run down. Well, shall I help myself? Tom demanded. You sounded well enough on the phone. With an effort, Wilson left the shade and support of the doorway and, breathing hard, unscrewed the cap of the tank. In the sunlight, his face was green. I didn't mean to interrupt your lunch, he said, but I need money pretty bad, and I was wondering what you were going to do with your old car. How do you like this one? Inquired Tom. I bought it last week. It's a nice yellow one, said Wilson, as he strained at the handle. Like to buy it? Big chance, Wilson smiled faintly. No, but I could make some money on the other. What do you want money for all of a sudden? I've been here too long. I want to get away. My wife and I want to go west. Your wife does? Exclaimed Tom, startled. She's been talking about it for 10 years. He rested for a moment against the pump, shading his eyes. And now she's going where she wants to, whether she wants to or not. I'm going to get her away. The coupe flashed by us with a flurry of dust and the flash of a waving hand. So now Gatsby and Daisy have just sped by them and waved their hand, kind of as in like a, ha-ha, we'll beat you there. What do I owe you? Demanded Tom harshly. I just got wised up to something funny these last 2 days, remarked Wilson. That's why I want to get away. That's why I've been bothering you about the car. What do I owe you? $1.20. The relentless beating heat was beginning to confuse me, and I had a bad moment there before I realized that so far his suspicions hadn't alighted on Tom. So George Wilson he said he's wised up to something funny. and he's moving Myrtle and himself out west, right? They've been here too long, and whether she likes it or not, we are moving. And so he knows that Myrtle is having an affair, and yet he still does not know who she is having that affair with. So continuing. He had discovered that Myrtle had some sort of life apart from him in another world, and the shock had made him physically sick. I stared at him and then at Tom, who had made a parallel discovery less than an hour before, and it occurred to me that there was no difference between men, in intelligence or race, so profound as the difference between the sick and the well. Wilson was so sick that he looked guilty, unforgivably guilty, as if he had just got some poor girl with child. "I'll let you have that car," said Tom. "I'll send it over tomorrow afternoon." That locality was always vaguely disquieting. So the locality that he's talking about is the Valley of Ashes, and disquieting means kind of uncomfortable. So the locality was always vaguely disquieting, even in the broad glare of afternoon. And now I turned my head as though I had been warned of something behind. Over the ash heaps, the giant eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg kept their vigil. But I perceived, after a moment, that other eyes were regarding us with peculiar intensity from less than 20 feet away. In one of the windows over the garage, the curtains had been moved aside a little, and Myrtle Wilson was peering down at the car. So engrossed was she that she had no consciousness of being observed, and one emotion after another crept into her face like objects into a slowly developing picture. Her expression was curiously familiar. It was an expression I had often seen on women's faces, but on Myrtle Wilson's face it seemed purposeless and inexplicable until I realized that her eyes, wide with jealous terror, were fixed not on Tom but on Jordan Baker, whom she took to be his wife. So, Tom, Jordan, Nick are all at Wilson's garage getting gas. George is talking about the fact that he has discovered that there is an affair going on with Myrtle. And we see, and Nick notices, it's not just the billboard eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg, who, remember, represents kind of this idea of a God who does not care, a God who just watches the suffering and the poor in the Valley of Ashes, but has no power or ability to help them, and he's forgotten about. So remember, that's what Dr. T.J. Eckelberg represents. But it's not just the billboard that's overlooking these events. It's Myrtle Wilson, who from that window up there is looking down and seeing Jordan Baker. And she believes that Jordan Baker, because she's never seen Daisy before, Tom has never, mixed his actual life with his affair before. And so she is assuming that Jordan Baker is his wife and that Tom owns the yellow car, that this is Tom's car, Tom's wife. And he notices her, but he just decides to drive away anyway because he's still hot on the trail of Daisy and Gatsby and going to New York. Likewise, before we go on, I also want to talk about this quote that I put on the screen. And this is called parallelism, parallel structure. It's not a geometry term, but it's just a term that is used in literature where you have two characters or two events that mirror each other in what is happening. So we have Tom, who just discovered 30 minutes earlier that his wife is cheating on him, and George, who likewise has discovered that his wife is cheating on him. Now, both of these men essentially, and this can be proven in a couple of later quotes, both of these men never thought that their wives were either capable of doing this or would ever do this because they were these men were so sure in their relationships that with Tom, that Tom could have an affair, but it wasn't okay for Daisy to necessarily have one, or Daisy, it would never cross her mind that she was capable of that as well. And so the bolded line, then at Tom, who made a parallel discovery less than an hour before. And so Nick's drawing this connection, and he said, and this is a great quote for wealth. He said, "It occurred to me that there is no difference between men. So they're the same, both in intelligence or race. No matter your intelligence level or your race, there's no greater difference than the difference between the sick and the well." Because George, if you look at the picture on the screen, George looks like he is actually sick. He doesn't have any money. He's trying to, make a living from this garage. And the only thing that he has is Myrtle. And guess what? Myrtle has emotionally and essentially physically left him, and it is making him absolutely sick. There's a lack of confidence, there's a lack of security there. And the difference between him and Tom is that it pisses Tom off because Tom has seemingly lost control of his life, but it doesn't physically make him unwell because, again, Tom is confident, Tom is aggressive, he knows how to fix it, and he has the ability and potentially the wealth to be able to do that. He plays around with people's lives and it doesn't matter as much to him. So we are continuing. Okay. There's no confusion like the confusion of a simple mind. And as we drove away, Tom was feeling the hot whips of panic. His wife and his mistress, until an hour ago secure and inviolate, were slipping precipitately from his control. So remember, Tom is all about control, all about being aggressive and confident and arrogant and having all of his ducks in a line. And now he is seen. Now Myrtle is being moved out west. So he can no longer control her. He can no longer continue his affair because George is moving them. And also he doesn't want to be caught by George that he's the one that Myrtle's having an affair with. And likewise, Daisy, his pride and his joy, this person that he defends, even though he cheats on her, is now having an affair with Gatsby. And so this dude is worried. Everything that he believes that he has control over, his confidence in his manlyhood and his ability to be a husband and a, boyfriend to Myrtle it's starting to crumble. And what's that going to do to somebody who needs to have his life in control? Well, we'll see in the next couple lines. Instinct made him step on the accelerator with the double purpose of overtaking Daisy and leaving Wilson behind. So who does he choose? Does he choose Myrtle and to get Myrtle into the car so that she doesn't move west because, he loves her so much? Or does he choose Daisy and to get Daisy back? Well, it's clear. He's overtaking Daisy and leaving Wilson behind. And we sped along toward Astoria at 50 miles an hour until among the spidery girders of the elevated, we came in sight of the easygoing blue coupe. Those big movies around 50th Street are cool, suggested Jordan. I love New York on summer afternoons when everyone's away. There's something very sensuous about it, overripe, as if all sorts of funny fruits were going to fall into your hands. The word sensuous had the effect of further disquieting Tom. And again, sensuous is sensual. It deals with sex and sexuality and attraction. And again, Tom is just aware that his wife is sleeping with another man. And so it had the effect of further disquieting him or further making him uncomfortable and angry. But before he could invent a protest, the coupe came to a stop and Daisy signaled us to draw up alongside. "Where are we going?" she cried. "How about the movies?" "It's so hot," she complained. "You go. We'll ride around and meet you after." With an effort, her wit rose faintly. "We'll meet you on some corner. I'll be the man smoking 2 cigarettes. So she's being lighthearted and trying to be funny. "We can't argue about it here," said Tom impatiently, as a truck gave out a cursing whistle behind us. "You follow me to the south side of Central Park, in front of the plaza." Several times he turned his head and looked back for their car, and if the traffic delayed, then he slowed up until they came into sight. I think he was very afraid they would dart down a side street and out of his life forever. So again, he's terrified that she's just going to disappear. But they didn't. And we all took the less explicable step of engaging the parlor of a suite in the Plaza Hotel. So on the screen is a picture of the Plaza. So this is the picture from the movie in the background, and this is a picture of a trip that I went to New York a couple years ago. And the Plaza is something that existed not only in the 1920s, but also still exists today. It's one of the fanciest, most well-known hotels probably in the entire United States as well as the world. It's very expensive. Rooms today range from anywhere from $750 starting price to $2,000 a night. And you have to reserve very, very far in advance. But remember, they have money. This is just what you do. Why not pay $700 or however much it was back then to just stay in a room for fun and for entertainment because they have the money to burn. So the prolonged and tumultuous argument that ended by herding us into that room eludes me. Though I have a sharp physical memory that, in the course of it, my underwear kept climbing like a damp snake around my legs, and the intermittent beads of sweat raced cool across my back, The notion originated with Daisy's suggestion that we hire 5 bathrooms and take cold baths, and then assumed more tangible form as a place to have a mint julep. Each of us said over and over that this was a crazy idea. We all talked at once to a baffled clerk and thought, or pretended to think, that we were being very funny. The room was large and stifling, and though it was already 4 o'clock, opening the windows admitted only a gust of hot shrubbery from the park. Daisy went to the mirror and stood with her back to us, fixing her hair. It's a swell suite, whispered Jordan respectfully, and everyone laughed. Open another window, commanded Daisy without turning around. There aren't any more. Well, we'd better telephone for an axe. The thing to do is to forget about the heat, said Tom impatiently. You make it 10 times worse by crabbing about it. He unrolled the bottle of whiskey and from the towel and put it on the table. Why not let her alone, old sport, remarked Gatsby. You're not the one that wanted to come to town. Or you're the one that wanted to come to town. There was a moment of silence. The telephone book slipped from its nail and splashed onto the floor, whereupon Jordan whispered, Excuse me. But this time, no one laughed. So again, Gatsby has now become mad at Tom. And obviously there's some tension there that's probably going to be fought out soon. I'll pick it up, I offered. I've got it. Gatsby examined the parted string, muttered, in an interested way, and tossed the book on a chair. That's a great expression of yours, isn't it? Said Tom sharply. What is? All this old sport business. Where'd you pick that up? Now see here, Tom, said Daisy, turning around from the mirror. If you're going to make personal remarks, I won't stay here a minute. Call up and order some ice for the mint julep. Back then, getting personal, and especially personal in a way that is angry or tense, especially with strangers or people that you're not very comfortable with, was seen as very inappropriate. That's not what you did. You didn't have manners if you brought stuff up that wasn't necessary to be brought up. And so that's kind of what Daisy's referring to. As Tom took up the receiver, the compressed heat exploded into sound, and we were listening to the pretentious chords of Mendelssohn's Wedding March from the ballroom below. So there's a wedding going on underneath, which is obvious. It's ironic, right? Because not only is a marriage is starting at the bottom floor of the plaza, and now we're seeing if a marriage is going to end up on one of the floors above. Imagine marrying anybody in this heat, cried Jordan dismally. Still, I was married in the middle of June, Daisy remembered. Louisville in June. Somebody fainted. Who was it fainted, Tom? Biloxi, he answered shortly. A man named Biloxi. Biloxi, and he made boxes. That's a fact, and he was from Biloxi, Tennessee. They carried him into my house, appended Jordan, because we lived just 2 doors down from the church, and he stayed 3 weeks until Daddy told him he had to get out. The day after he left, Daddy died. After a moment, she added, as if this might have sounded irreverent. There wasn't any connection. I used to know a Bill Biloxi from Memphis, I remarked. That was his cousin. I knew his whole family history before he left. He gave me an aluminum putter that I use today. The music had died down as the ceremony began, and now a long cheer floated in at the window, followed by intimate cries of yeah, and finally by a burst of jazz as the dancing began. We're getting old, said Daisy. If we were young, we'd rise and dance. Remember Biloxi? Jordan warned her. Where'd you know him, Tom? Biloxi? He concentrated with effort. I didn't know him. He was a friend of Daisy's. He was not, she denied. I'd never seen him before. He came down in the private car. Well, he said he knew you. He said he was raised in Louisville. Asa Bird brought him around at the last minute and asked if we had room for him. Jordan smiled. He was probably bumming his way home. He told me he was the president of your class at Yale. Tom and I looked at each other blankly. Biloxi? First place. We didn't have any president. Gatsby's foot beat a short, restless tattoo, and Tom eyed him suddenly. So Biloxi is a gatecrasher. Why is this seemingly random conversation going on right now? There's a lot of different theories. One theory could be that Gatsby is almost like a gatecrasher in Tom and Daisy's marriage, or vice versa. That Tom is a gatecrasher into Daisy and Gatsby's, love affair that started before Tom was in the picture. You can come up with your own theory. Nothing really has been proven, but that might be a potential reason that's here. So Gatsby's getting restless. He's beating his foot. By the way, Mr. Gatsby, I understand you're an Oxford man. Not exactly. Oh, yes. I understand you went to Oxford. So Tom is challenging him, right? Remember, nobody really believes that Gatsby went to Oxford, and so Tom is really trying to call him out and put him in an uncomfortable situation. And this kind of begins the big scene at the Plaza Hotel. So it's where the whole elephants in the room, those like big things that are never spoken about, are going to start coming out. And the first one is whether or not Gatsby actually went to Oxford like he's been telling everybody. A pause. Then Tom's voice, incredulous and insulting. You must have gone there about the time Biloxi went to New Haven. So remember, they said that Biloxi was a liar, he was a gatecrasher, that he wasn't a president. And so he's now making the connection that Biloxi is a liar just like Gatsby is. Another pause. A waiter knocked and came in with crushed mint and ice, but the silence was unbroken by this thank you and the soft closing of the door. This tremendous detail was to be cleared up at last. So whether or not Gatsby actually lied. I told you I went there, said Gatsby. I heard you, but I'd like to know when. It was in 1919. I only stayed 5 months. That's why I really can't call myself an Oxford man. Tom glanced around to see if we mirrored his unbelief. But we were all looking at Gatsby. It was an opportunity they gave to some of the officers after the armistice, he continued. We could go to any of the universities in England or France. I wanted to get up and slap him on the back. I had one of those renewals of complete faith in him that I'd experienced before. Daisy rose, smiling faintly, and went to the table. So, Gatsby didn't actually attend Oxford for the entirety of his, undergraduate career, but he did go. And so this thing that people had challenged whether or not it was true has been proven true. And Gatsby never was specific, right? He just said, oh, I went to Oxford. I was educated at Oxford. And he let people believe as much as they wanted to about that without explicitly lying or saying that he went there for a period of time. And Nick is now expressing, okay, good. He's not a liar. I believe him. My faith is renewed in him. Open the whiskey, Tom, she ordered, and I'll make you a mint julep. Then you won't seem so stupid to yourself. Look at the mint. Wait a minute, snapped Tom. I want to ask Mr. Gatsby one more question. Go on, Gatsby said politely. What kind of row are you trying to cause in my house anyhow? And now this is the big elephant in the room, that Gatsby and Daisy are having an affair, and Gatsby is trying to cause a row or a big issue in Tom Buchanan's household, his relationship with Daisy. So Tom is calling him out in front of all of these people, which, as you can imagine, is highly uncomfortable. They were out in the open at last, and Gatsby was content because finally Gatsby doesn't have to hide his affair with Daisy. He isn't causing a row. Daisy looked desperately from one to the other. You're causing a row. Please have a little self-control. Self-control, repeated Tom incredulously. I suppose the latest thing is to sit back and let Mr. Nobody from nowhere make love to your wife. Well, if that's the idea, you can count me out. Nowadays, people begin by sneering at family life and family institutions, and then they'll throw everything overboard and have intermarriage between black and white. So here we have Tom being proven as an absolute hypocrite, right? Because everyone knows that Tom has had multiple affairs, and yet he has the gall and the confidence to get mad and pissed at Daisy for doing what he has already done to her. And then he pretends to be this self-righteous guy by saying, oh, well, people are going to, by doing this, if this is the trend, then family institutions are going to crumble and family life is going to break down. And if that breaks down and this pillar of society breaks down, then guess what? Black people and white people are going to get married. And here's another quote proving that Tom is not only ignorant, a hypocrite, but also racist. Flushed with his impassioned gibberish, he saw himself standing alone on the last barrier of civilization. So this is a hyperbole, right? It's as if Tom is like standing at the barrier at the end of civilization with a, wearing armor of righteousness, right? That he is the person that will fight to keep marriages together. So it's very ironic. And then, Jordan steps in. Well, we're all white here, murmured Jordan. I know I'm not very popular. I don't give big parties. I suppose you've got to make your house into a pigsty in order to have any friends in the modern world. So now he's insulting Gatsby's lifestyle. Angry as I was, as we all were, I was tempted to laugh whenever Tom opened his mouth. The transition from libertine to prig was so complete. So again, nobody in that room has respect for Tom at all. They want to laugh at how ridiculous he's being. I've got something to tell you, old sport, began Gatsby. But Daisy guessed at his intention. Please don't, she interrupted helplessly. Please, let's all go home. Why don't we all go home? And again, she knows that all Gatsby wants is for her to admit to Tom that she never loved Tom. That would complete Gatsby's kind of dream, that she has always been in love with Gatsby, but just had to marry Tom out of inconvenience. And that's the next elephant in the room that's going to come out. That question of whether or not Daisy actually loves Gatsby and loves Gatsby the way that Gatsby wants to be loved. The picture on the screen is what the room looks like in the movie. And just as we're talking about colors and their symbolism, notice the primary colors in here and how that connects to Myrtle's apartment as well as the symbolism of love. That's a good idea. I got up. Nick's trying to, avoid disaster. Come on, Tom. Nobody wants a drink. I want to know what Mr. Gatsby has to tell me. Your wife doesn't love you, said Gatsby. She's never loved you. She loves me. You must be crazy, exclaimed Tom automatically. Gatsby sprang to his feet, vivid with excitement. She never loved you, do you hear? He cried. She only married you because I was poor and she was tired of waiting for me. It was a terrible mistake, but in her heart she never loved anyone except me. At this point, Jordan and I tried to go, because again, this is a very personal conversation, and Jordan and Nick are not involved in any of these relationships and are just awkwardly viewing this massive mess. But Tom and Gatsby insisted with competitive firmness that we remain, as though neither of them had anything to conceal, and it would be a privilege to partake vicariously of their emotions. Sit down, Daisy, Tom's voice groped unsuccessfully for a paternal tone. What's been going on? I want to hear all about it. I told you what's been going on, said Gatsby. Going on for 5 years, and you didn't know. Tom turned to Daisy sharply. You've been seeing this fellow for 5 years? Not seeing, said Gatsby. No, we couldn't meet, but both of us loved each other all that time, old sport, and you didn't know. I used to laugh sometimes, but there was no laughter in his eyes. To think that you didn't know. Oh, that's all? Tom tapped his thick fingers together like a clergyman and leaned back in his chair. You're crazy, he exploded. I can't speak about what happened 5 years ago because I didn't know Daisy then. And I'll be damned if I see how you got within a mile of her unless you brought the groceries to the back door. But all the rest of that's a goddamned lie. Daisy loved me when she married me, and she loves me now. So they're almost having a tug-of-war fight over Daisy. And who is the only silent person in this conversation up to that point? Daisy, right? Gatsby and Tom are trying to fight over, well, Daisy loves me, or Daisy's loved me longer, or Daisy actually loves me, and who does she want to end up being with? And Gatsby is so trying to prove that his version of events that he's been building up in his brain for 5 years is accurate, while Tom is saying that, you're just this poor person. The only way that you would have known her was by bringing her groceries, which is a huge insult. Because he's essentially calling him just like a poor working class man when, he is this wealthy dude. Okay, so he says, Daisy loved me when she married me and she loves me now. No, said Gatsby, shaking his head. She does, though. The trouble is that sometimes she gets foolish ideas into her head and she doesn't know what she's doing. So again, he's saying his wife is a fool and she doesn't know what she's doing. He nodded sagely. And what's more, I love Daisy too. Once in a while, I go off on a spree and make a fool of myself, but I always come back, and in my heart, I love her all the time. You're revolting, said Daisy. She turned to me, and her voice, dropping an octave lower, filled the room with thrilling scorn. Do you know why we left Chicago? I'm surprised that they didn't treat you to the story of that little spree. Gatsby walked over and stood beside her. Daisy, that's all over now, he said earnestly. It doesn't matter anymore. Just tell him the truth, that you never loved him, and that it's all wiped out forever. She looked at him blindly. Why, how could I love him? Possibly. And again, she's phrasing this as a question, so you can tell that she's not necessarily sure of what she's even saying right now. You never loved him, says Gatsby. She hesitated. Her eyes fell on Jordan and me with a sort of appeal, as though she realized at last what she was doing, and as though she had never, all along, intended doing anything at all. But it was done now. It was too late. So for the first time, Daisy's realizing what her affair is costing not only her and Gatsby, but also Tom. Before, I don't think she thought that there were going to be any consequences, and now she's being faced with the consequences right here, having to choose to say that she's never loved Tom and she's always loved Gatsby, or to tell Gatsby that she does love Tom and she loves him, which again would crush Gatsby's dreams. I never loved him, she said, with perceptible reluctance. Not at Capiolani? Demanded Tom suddenly. No. From the ballroom beneath, muffled and suffocating chords were drifting up on hot waves of air. Not that day I carried you down from the punch bowl to keep your shoes dry? There was a husky tenderness in his tone. Daisy? So now Tom's being sweet, and Tom's like almost hurt that Daisy would say that she never loved him. So obviously Tom does feel a version of love for her, potentially. Please don't. Her voice was cold, but the rancor was gone from it. She looked at Gatsby. There, Jay, she said. But her hand, as she tried to light a cigarette, was trembling. So obviously this is causing her a lot of effort, and tons of emotions are rolling through her. Suddenly, she threw the cigarette and the burning match on the carpet. Oh, you want too much, she cried to Gatsby. I love you now. Isn't that enough? I can't help what's past. She began to sob helplessly. I did love him once, but I love you too. Gatsby's eyes opened and closed. You loved me, too? He repeated. Even that's a lie, said Tom savagely. She didn't know you were alive. Why, there are things between Daisy and me that you'll never know, things that neither of us can ever forget. One of them being a child, right? Kind of what was shown in the beginning of that chapter. So Gatsby, all he wanted was for Daisy to just say that nothing had changed, that 5 years ago was still happening, and yet she cannot do that. She cannot truly and honestly say that she never loved Tom. And for Gatsby, I don't think that's enough. The words seem to bite physically into Gatsby. He is physically hurting by hearing Tom talk about this, and by hearing Daisy say that she had loved Tom. I want to speak to Daisy alone, Gatsby insisted. She's all excited now. Even alone, I can't say I never loved Tom, she admitted in a pitiful voice. It wouldn't be true. Of course it wouldn't, agreed Tom. She turned at her husband. As if it mattered to you, she said. Of course it matters. I'm going to take better care of you from now on. You don't understand, said Gatsby with a touch of panic. So again, now he is losing control of Daisy, and he's panicking. You don't understand, said Gatsby with a touch of panic. You're not going to take care of her anymore. I'm not. Tom opened his eyes wide and laughed. He could afford to control himself now, because now Tom knows that he's won. Why's that? Daisy's leaving you. Nonsense. I am, though, she said with visible effort. She's not leaving me. Tom's words suddenly leaned down over Gatsby. Certainly not for a common swindler who'd have to steal the ring he put on her finger. I won't stand this, cried Daisy. Oh, please, let's get out. Who are you anyhow? Broke out Tom. You're one of that bunch that hangs out with Meyer Wolfsheim. That much I happen to know. I've made a little investigation into your affairs, and I'll carry it further tomorrow. You can suit yourself about that, old sport, said Gatsby steadily. I found out what your drug stores were. He turned to us and spoke rapidly. He and this Wolfsheim bought up a lot of side street drugstores here and in Chicago and sold grain alcohol over the counter. Because remember, it's the prohibition, right? So you're not allowed to have alcohol. So those that made alcohol and sold it got lots and lots of money. That's one of his little stunts. I picked him for a bootlegger the first time I saw him, and I wasn't far from wrong. What about it? Said Gatsby politely. I guess your friend Walter Chase wasn't too proud to come in on it. And you left him in the lurch, didn't you? You let him go to jail for a month over in New Jersey. God, you ought to hear Walter on the subject of you. He came to us dead broke. He was very glad to pick up some money, old sport. Don't you call me old sport, cried Tom. Gatsby said nothing. Walter could have you up on the betting laws too, but Wolfsheim scared him into shutting his mouth. That unfamiliar yet recognizable look was back again in Gatsby's face. That drugstore business was just small change, continued Tom slowly. But you've got something on now that Walter's afraid to tell me about. I glanced at Daisy, who was staring terrified between Gatsby and her husband, and at Jordan, who had begun to balance an invisible but absorbing object on the tip of her chin. Then I turned back to Gatsby and was startled at his expression. He looked, and this is said in all contempt for the babbled slander of his garden, as if he had killed a man. For a moment, the set of his face could be described in just that fantastic way. So, up until this point in time, we know that Gatsby's been probably involved with Meyer Wolfsheim. We know that he's gained a lot of money, and that's what's given him a measure of respect within the wealthy community. But the fact that he's not only gained money through breaking the law, but also through betting and through something that is so secretive, which is probably so dangerous and so bad that nobody will even talk about it, has just cut Gatsby's legs out from under him, because old money and Daisy have been raised on this idea of gentility and elegance and being kind of above it all. And although Gatsby has the money and the trappings of wealth, the way that he has done it and gained that is in a way that counteracts everything that old money represents. It wasn't done through investment. It wasn't done through family inheritance and stocks. It was done through illegal crime and activity, which now doesn't make Gatsby elegant. It makes him a criminal. And you can notice what's going on here, right? And he also looks, when this is revealed, that he killed a man, right? And Nick says, I didn't really believe any of that stuff in the party, but now I can see that he actually looks like this. It passed, and then he began to talk excitedly to Daisy, denying everything, defending his name against accusations that had not been made. But with every word, she was drawing further and further into herself. So he gave that up, and only the dead dream fought on as the afternoon slipped away, trying to touch what was no longer tangible, struggling unhappily, undespairingly toward the lost voice across the room. So I'm going to pause real quick and talk about this. So I have just taken that last quote and I have put it up on the screen, right? We've talked about Daisy, how she is associated with the green light, and the green light represents hope. But we also know that Daisy not only represents hope and the green light, but she also represents wealth, and that is specifically through her voice. And so this idea that she is drawing further and further into herself. She is no longer that happier girl that she was, who loved Gatsby and was dancing excitedly at the house earlier in this chapter, who was kissing Gatsby when her husband wasn't looking, or saying that she loves him. She is now drawing further and further away from him, so that Gatsby gave up in trying to convince her that everything was okay and none of this was true. And then this is the first time that this is said this way. His dead dream fought. So his dream, his idea of of Daisy and love and hope and wealth is dead. And he is still trying to touch, again, what is no longer tangible. He can no longer touch it or reach it. He is unhappily fighting against that loss. And then finally it says this, toward that lost voice across the room. And now we know that Daisy is directly associated with money, just as her voice. And so she is not the green light. This green light is lost, this dream and this hope is lost, and this idea of money or wealth in America is gone forever because of this big revelation that he is a criminal. The voice begged again to go. Please, Tom, I can't stand this anymore. Her frightened eyes told that whatever intentions, whatever courage she had had, were definitely gone. You two start on home, Daisy, said Tom, in Mr. Gatsby's car. She looked at Tom, alarmed now, but he insisted with magnanimous scorn. Go on, he won't annoy you. I think he realizes that his presumptuous little flirtation is over. And so, in one sweep of revealing Gatsby's true nature, Tom is now confident that Daisy will never leave him, that the affair is over, and so confident that he is now letting Daisy and Gatsby, without jealousy or without concern, drive back together because he knows his wife well enough to know that this is over. They were gone without a word, snapped out, made accidental, isolated like ghosts, even from our pity. After a moment, Tom got up and began wrapping the unopened bottle of whiskey in the towel. Want any of this stuff? Jordan? Nick? I didn't answer. Nick? He asked again. What? Want any? No. I just remembered that today is my birthday. I was 30. Before me stretched the portentous, menacing road of a new decade. This seems kind of random, and a lot of students laugh at it, and it is kind of laughable. But again, Nick is somebody who's so consumed with other people and so consumed with observing other people, and was so pulled into the drama that he doesn't even remember, like, the most important day of a year for most people, which is it's his birthday, because again, he's so absorbed with observing others. It was 7 o'clock, and we got into the coupe with him and started for Long Island. So now everyone's in their own car. Tom, Jordan, and Nick are all back in Tom's blue car, and now Gatsby and Daisy are back in the yellow car. Tom talked incessantly, exulting and laughing, but his voice was as remote from Jordan and me as the foreign clamor on the sidewalk or the tumult of the elevated overhead. Human sympathy has its limits, and we were content to let all their tragic arguments fade with the city lights behind. 30. The promise of a decade of loneliness, a thinning list of single men to know, a thinning briefcase of enthusiasm, thinning hair. But there was Jordan beside me who, unlike Daisy, was too wise ever to carry well-forgotten dreams from age to age. And as we passed over the dark bridge, her wan face fell lazily against my coat's shoulder, and formidable stroke of 30 died away with the reassuring pressure of her hand. So we drove on toward death through the cooling twilight. And this is a great line. This is a great foreshadowing line. So we drove on towards death through the cooling twilight. What does that mean? We don't know exactly yet, but we will find out soon. The young Greek Michaelis, who ran the coffee joint beside the ash heaps, this is in the Valley of Ashes, was the principal witness at the inquest. He had slept through the heat until after 5 when he strolled over to the garage and found George Wilson sick in his office, really sick, pale as his own pale hair and shaking all over. Michaelis advised him to go to bed, but Wilson refused, saying that he'd miss a lot of business if he did. While his neighbor was trying to persuade him, a violent racket broke out overhead. "I've got my wife locked up in there," explained Wilson calmly. "She's going to stay there until the day after tomorrow, and then we're going to move away." Michaelis was astonished. They had been neighbors for 4 years, and Wilson had never seemed faintly capable of such a statement. Generally, he is one of those worn-out men. Again, help to the Valley of Ashes, he's worn out. When he wasn't working, he sat on a chair in the doorway and stared at the people and the cars that passed along the road. When anyone spoke to him, he invariably laughed in agreement, in an agreeable, colorless way. He was his wife's man and not his own. So naturally, Michaelis tried to find out what had happened, but Wilson wouldn't say a word. Instead, he began to throw curious, suspicious glances at his visitor and asked him what he'd been doing at certain times on certain days. So George Wilson is trying to figure out who his wife is having an affair with, and he assumes that Michaelis, this guy that's talking to him, is one of those men. Just as the latter was getting uneasy, some workmen came past the door, bound for his restaurant, and Michaelis took the opportunity to get away, intending to come back later. But he didn't. He supposed he forgot to, that's all. When he came outside again, a little after 7, he was reminded of the conversation, because he heard Mrs. Wilson's voice, loud and scolding, downstairs in the garage. "Beat me," he heard her cry. "Throw me down and beat me, you dirty little coward." A moment later, she rushed out into the dusk, waving her hands and shouting. Before he could move from his door, the business was over. The death car, as the newspapers called it, didn't stop. It came out from the gathering darkness, wavered tragically for a moment, then disappeared around the next bend. Michaelis wasn't even sure of its color. He had told the first policeman that it was light green. The other car, the one going toward New York, came to rest 100 yards beyond, and its driver hurried back to where Myrtle Wilson, her life violently extinguished, knelt in the road and mingled her thick dark blood with the dust. Michaelis and this man reached her first, but when they had torn open her shirtwaist, still damp with perspiration, they saw that her left breast was swinging loose like a flap, and there was no need to listen for the heart beneath. The mouth was wide open and ripped at the corners, as though she had choked a little in giving up the tremendous vitality she had stored so long. And so we have this random scene where it doesn't seem like Nick is observing this, but that he's heard from somebody else. And it is that Myrtle was finally released from her prison upstairs where George had locked her away. And she sees a car in the middle of the road, and she runs out to get that car's attention. And so this is her running out to get the car's attention, and the car does not stop. The car, instead of accidentally crashing into the car that's coming the opposite direction, ends up crashing into Myrtle, and Myrtle dies. She gets hit instantly. So it's called a death car in the newspapers. And it's a fantastic line that shows, it says, Myrtle Wilson, her life violently extinguished. Remember, earlier on, Myrtle Wilson is usually compared to fire. She has a smoldering vitality. And so this word extinguish is very purposeful, right? Because what do you do to fires? You extinguish them. Fire extinguishers, right? And so her life was violently extinguished, and she's just sitting in the road, dead. Now, why she ran out into the middle of the street, we can talk about a little bit later. So now we're going back to Nick as he observes this. We saw the 3 or 4 automobiles and the crowd when we were still some distance away. So remember, they're coming from New York, and they have to pass through the Valley of Ashes. Wreck, said Tom. That's good. Wilson will have a little business at last. So again, they don't know what's happened. He slowed down, but still without any intention of stopping, until as we came nearer, the hushed, intent faces of people at the garage door made him automatically put on the brakes. We'll take a look, he said doubtfully. Just a look. I became aware now of a hollow wailing sound which issued incessantly from the garage, a sound which, as we got out of the coupe and walked toward the door, resolved itself into the words, "Oh my God," uttered over and over again in a gasping moan. There's some bad trouble here, said Tom excitedly. He reached up on tiptoes and peered over a circle of heads into the garage, which was lit only by a yellow light and the swinging wire basket overhead. Then he made a harsh sound in his throat, and with a violent thrusting movement of his powerful arms, pushed his way through. The circle closed up again with a running murmur of expostulation. It was a minute before I could see anything at all. Then new arrivals disarranged the line, and Jordan and I were pushed suddenly inside. Myrtle Wilson's body, wrapped in a blanket and then in another blanket, as though she suffered from a chill in the hot night, lay on a work table by the wall, and Tom, with his back to us, was bending over it, motionless. Next to him stood a motorcycle policeman, taking down names with much sweat and correction in his little book. At first, I couldn't find the source of the high, groaning words that echoed clamorously through the bare garage. Then I saw Wilson standing on the raised threshold of his office, swaying back and forth and holding to the doorpost with both hands. Some man was talking to him in a low voice and attempting, from time to time, to lay a hand on his shoulder, but Wilson neither heard nor saw. His eyes would drop slowly from their swinging light to the laden table by the wall, and then jerk back to the light again, and he gave out incessantly his high, horrible call. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. Presently, Tom lifted his head with a jerk, and after staring around the garage with glazed eyes, addressed a mumbled, incoherent remark to the policeman. M-A-V, the policeman was saying. O. No, R, corrected the man. M-A-V-R-O. Listen to me, muttered Tom fiercely. R, said the policeman. O. G. G. He looked up as Tom's broad hand fell sharply on his shoulder. What do you want, fella? What happened? That's what I want to know. Auto hit her. Instantly killed. Instantly killed, repeated Tom, staring. She ran out in a road. Son of a bitch didn't even stop his car. There was 2 cars, said Michaelis. One comin', one goin', see? Goin' where? Asked the policeman keenly. One goin' each way. Well, His hand rose toward the blankets, but stopped halfway and fell to his side. She ran out there to the one coming from New York, knocked right out into her, going 30 or 40 miles an hour. What's the name of this place here? Demanded the officer. Hasn't got any name. A pale, well-dressed Negro stepped near. It was a yellow car, he said. Big yellow car, new. See the accident? Asked the policeman. No, but the car passed me going down the road, going faster than 40, going 50, 60. Come here and let's have your name. Look out now. I want to get his name. Some words of this conversation must have reached Wilson, swaying in the office door, for suddenly a new theme found voice among his gasping cries. You don't have to tell me what kind of car it was. I know what kind of car it was. Watching Tom, I saw the wad of muscle back of his shoulder tighten under his coat. He walked quickly over to Wilson and, standing in front of him, seized him firmly by the upper arms. You've got to pull yourself together, he said with soothing gruffness. Wilson's eyes fell upon Tom. He started up on his tiptoes and then would have collapsed to his knees had not Tom held him upright. Listen, said Tom, shaking him a little bit. I just got here a minute ago from New York. I was bringing you that coupe we've been talking about. That yellow car I was driving this afternoon wasn't mine, do you hear? I haven't seen it all afternoon. Only the Negro and I were near enough to hear what he said, but the policeman caught something in the tone and looked over with truculent eyes. What's all that? He demanded. I'm a friend of his. Tom turned his head but kept his hands firm on Wilson's body. He says he knows the car that did it. It was a yellow car. Some dim impulse moved the policeman to look suspiciously at Tom. And what color's your car? It's a blue car, a coupe. We've come straight from New York, I said. Someone who had been driving a little behind us confirmed this, and the policeman turned away. Now, if you'll let me have that name again correct. Picking up Wilson like a doll, Tom carried him into the office, set him down in a chair, and came back. Okay, so if you don't know what's going on yet, what happened is Daisy and Gatsby were driving back to New York. And remember, they are now driving in the yellow car that Tom had been driving earlier. And Myrtle saw Tom in that yellow car. So what happened is Myrtle was escaped from her prison and saw that yellow car that she believed Tom was driving. And she's running out because she doesn't want to move to the West. She doesn't want to go away. She wants to be with Tom. She wants to get married to Tom. So she thinks that this yellow car approaching has Tom in it because that's what it had before. And there's another car that's coming at the same time. So the person, assuming it's Gatsby driving the yellow car, the person has a choice. You either hit the car that's coming towards you or you hit the person. And so instead of hitting the car, the yellow car ended up hitting Myrtle and killing her instantly. And this is why Tom's paranoid. Remember, Tom is in control. Tom is manipulative. And that's why he says to George, who remember saw him driving the yellow car earlier, he says, listen, I just got here a minute. I haven't seen that yellow car since this afternoon. So he's trying to remove every opportunity of blame from himself, as well as get George and the policeman thinking that he has nothing to do with this. If somebody will come here and sit with him, he snapped authoritatively. He watched while the two men standing closest glanced at each other and went unwillingly into the room. Then Tom shut the door on them and came down the single step, his eyes avoiding the table. As he passed close to me, he whispered, "Let's get out." Self-consciously, with his authoritative arms breaking the way, we pushed through the still gathering crowd, passing a hurried doctor, case in hand, who had been sent for in Wild Hope half an hour ago. Tom drove slowly until we were beyond the bend. Then his foot came down hard, and the coupe raced along through the night. In a little while, I heard a low, husky sob and saw that tears were overflowing down his face. The goddamn coward, he whimpered. He didn't even stop his car. So Gatsby didn't stop the yellow car and just kept driving. The Buchanan's house floated suddenly toward us through the dark, rustling trees. Tom stopped beside the porch and looked up at the second floor, where two windows blossomed with light among the vines. Daisy's home, he said. As we got out of the car, he glanced at me and frowned slightly. I ought to have dropped you in West Egg, Nick. There's nothing we can do tonight. A change had come over him, and he spoke gravely, and with decision. As we walked across the moonlit gravel to the porch, he disposed of the situation with a few brisk phrases. I'll telephone for a taxi to take you home, and while you're waiting, you and Jordan better go in the kitchen and have them get you some supper, if you want any. He opened the door. Come in. No thanks, but I'd be glad if you'd order me the taxi. I'll wait outside. Jordan put her hand on my arm. Won't you come in, Nick? No thanks. I was feeling a little sick, and I wanted to be alone. But Jordan lingered for a moment more. It's only 9:30, she said. I'd be damned if I'd go in. I'd had enough of all of them for one day, and suddenly that included Jordan too. She must have seen something of this in my expression, for she turned abruptly away and ran up the porch steps in the house. I sat down for a few minutes with my head in my hands until I heard the phone taken up inside and the butler's voice calling a taxi. Then I walked slowly down the river, away from the house, intending to wait by the gate. I hadn't gone 20 yards when I heard my name, and Gatsby stepped from between the two bushes in the path. I must have felt pretty weird by that time, because I could think of nothing except the luminosity of his pink suit under the moon. So for once, Nick shows a backbone, right? Nick usually is pressured into situations, but right now we see that his character has changed. He has gotten so sick and so tired of all this drama and just the awfulness of everything that's happened that he's like, you know what? I know you want me to come in. I know that would probably make you feel comfortable, but I don't want to have anything to do with you." And so he leaves. And as he's leaving, he sees that Gatsby's like hiding away in the bushes. "What are you doing?" I inquired. "Just standing here, old sport." Somehow that seemed a despicable occupation. For all I knew, he was going to rob the house in a moment. And remember, he's saying that because he now knows that Gatsby is a criminal. Not only is he a criminal who's gained all of his money through that, but he's now killed somebody. I wouldn't have been surprised to see sinister faces, the faces of Wolfsheim's people behind him in the dark shrubbery. "Did you see any trouble on the road?" he asked after a minute. "Yes." He hesitated. "Was she killed?" "Yes." "I thought so. I told Daisy I thought so. It's better that the shock should come all at once. She stood it pretty well." He spoke as if Daisy's reaction was the only thing that mattered. Again, he's like, why do you care what Daisy thinks when you just killed somebody? "I got to West Egg by a side road," he went on, "and left the car in my garage. I don't think anybody saw us, but of course I can't be sure." I disliked him so much by this time that I didn't find it necessary to tell him he was wrong. "Who was the woman?" he inquired. "Her name was Wilson. Her husband owns the garage." "How the devil did it happen?" "Well, I tried to swing the wheel." He broke off, and suddenly I guessed at the truth. Was Daisy driving? "Yes," he said after a moment. "But of course I'll say I was. You see, when we left New York, she was very nervous, and she thought it would steady her to drive. And this woman rushed out at us just as we were passing a car coming the other way. It all happened in a minute, but it seemed to me that she wanted to speak to us, thought we were somebody she knew. Well, first, Daisy turned away from the woman toward the other car, and then she lost her nerve and turned back. The second my hand reached the wheel, I felt the shock. It must have killed her instantly. It ripped her open." "Don't tell me, old sport," he winced. "Anyhow, Daisy stepped on it. I tried to make her stop, but she couldn't. So I pulled on the emergency brake, then she fell over into my lap and I drove on." "She'll be all right tomorrow," he said presently. "I'm just going to wait here and see if he tries to bother her about that unpleasantness this afternoon. She's locked herself into her room, and if he tries any brutality, she's going to turn the light out and on again." "He won't touch her," I said. "He's not thinking about her. I don't trust him, old sport." So again, we find out that it wasn't Gatsby who was driving, it was Daisy. So Daisy was the person that ended up killing Myrtle Wilson. Now you can theorize maybe she knew what she was doing, right? And that she knew that Myrtle was in fact the girl that Tom was having an affair on, and this is her taking her anger out. Or you could, and this is more of what the text supports, you could theorize that it was either she was going to hit the car or she was going to hit the person. And like it says in the book, it says she lost her nerve and turned back. So rather risk her killing one person than killing all the people in each of the cars. And obviously, Gatsby tried stopping it and tried encouraging her to do the right thing by stopping and turning herself in. But she just kept driving. And now Gatsby's waiting to make sure that Tom doesn't like bully Daisy about everything, all of the drama that happened in the hotel room. "How long are you going to wait?" "All night if necessary." "Anyhow, till they all go to bed." A new point of view occurred to me. Suppose Tom found out that Daisy had been driving. He might think he saw a connection in it. He might think anything. I looked at the house. There were 2 or 3 bright windows downstairs and the pink glow from Daisy's room on the second floor. "You wait here," I said. "I'll see if there's any sign of commotion." I walked back along the border of the lawn, traversed the gravel softly, and tiptoed up the veranda steps. The drawing room curtains were open, and I saw that the room was empty. Crossing the porch where we had dined that June night 3 months before, I came to a small rectangle of light which I guessed was the pantry window. The blind was drawn, but I found a rift at the sill. Daisy and Tom were sitting opposite each other at the kitchen table with a plate of cold fried chicken between them and 2 bottles of ale. He was talking intently across the table at her, and in his earnestness his hand had fallen upon and covered her own. Once in a while she looked up at him and nodded in agreement. They weren't happy, and neither of them had touched the chicken or the ale, and yet they weren't unhappy either. There was an unmistakable air of natural intimacy about the picture, and anybody would have said that they were conspiring together. As I tiptoed from the porch, I heard my taxi feeling its way through the dark road toward the house. Gatsby was waiting where I left him in the drive. "Is it all quiet up there?" he asked anxiously. "Yes, it's all quiet," I hesitated. "You'd better come home and get some sleep." He shook his head. "I want to wait here until Daisy goes to bed. Good night, old sport." He put his hands on his coat pockets and turned back eagerly to the scrutiny of the house, as though my presence marred the sacredness of the vigil. So I walked away and left him standing there in the moonlight, watching over nothing. So you have this scene, right? Daisy, I mean, Gatsby has done everything for Daisy, and he believes that Daisy and Tom's relationship is over, and he still has this like hopeless romantic view that he will still be with Daisy, and Daisy will leave Tom for him. And yet Nick sees almost the truth that Daisy and Tom are almost, they're talking, everything's normal. It doesn't seem that there's any tension. There's some physical contact between them, and it almost looks like they're conspiring together, that they're trying to problem solve and deal with what's happened today, and not only with the accident, but also all of these revelations in the Plaza Hotel. And so Nick realizes that Gatsby is watching literally over nothing, and that Gatsby, this dream, this idea of Daisy and them being together, has officially ended. And so he's leaving him in the moonlight, watching over nothing. There's nothing to watch over because his dream is officially gone. And that brings us to the end of chapter 7.